This meeting is being live streamed. Do you consent to being live streamed? And we are now recording.
Back up here.
Greetings, everyone. Principiamos igitur. This is Charles Lincoln in New Orleans. We've got the honor of Jason Kessler from, where are you, by the way? Where are you anyhow?
Virginia. Somewhere
in Virginia. He wishes to remain obscure.
Yeah, I'll keep that a little bit close to the vest.
And Sam Dixon, of course. Oh, and here's Paul Frum calling. Let's see. Paul Frum, how are you, sir? Are you able to join us a little bit earlier than I had said originally? I sent you a link, and we're here. I've got Jason Kessler with us right now, so I rescheduled everything a little bit earlier. As soon as you can, but don't worry about it. Okay. Well, anyhow, the title was in fact suggested by Paul. He sent me this article, which I think he sent. I don't know if did I forward it to you, Jason?
The article? I don't think so.
Oh, okay. It's basically, let's see, the title was something on the order of, let's see, The American Universalist War Against Eastern Slavic Civilization. And you had said that you wanted to discuss something other than Charlottesville 101. And I had suggested to Sam that perhaps at some point you'll discuss Charlottesville Advanced Seminar 707, but we can hold off. Sam, we haven't talked in a couple of weeks because I have some sort of back condition which sounds very much like an ankylosaurus dinosaur.
You in our philosophy, you may have to be put to sleep.
Dinosaurs?
No, you. I mean, we cure people by putting them to sleep. Haven't you read what our enemies say about us? We'll just solve your health problem.
Well,
like a wounded horse. They shoot horses, don't they?
Well, people have tried to shoot me in the past, but
I've avoided that. I've only had a person, other than playing war in ROTC and the military, I've only had a person pull a gun on me seriously one time. And it certainly got my attention.
I believe it was it a person you knew or a stranger?
It was a stranger who came to my law office while everybody was out to lunch, who said he was having problems with his wife. And I took him to my room, my office, and he began telling me his story. And I very quickly realized that he was mentally ill. And he accused me of betraying him to his wife. And I pointed out to him that I'd never met him before and never did know his wife. He said, "No, you're like all the other lawyers who betrayed me." And he pulled the gun out and said, "I'm going to kill you." And aimed it at me and didn't pull the trigger. And I had read that you don't say use words like kill or murder or something to mentally ill people. So I tried to be pleasant and talk, but he got more and more agitated. And then the phone rang out on the secretary's desk. And I thought, this is my chance. So I said, "You'll have to excuse me for a moment." And I got up and walked out of the room, waiting trying to figure out if the bullet would hit me before I heard the noise. But I managed to get out into the lobby and then ran out and hid in the woods behind the building. And he came out and looked around and drove off. The next day he was arrested for assaulting another lawyer's secretary up on the square. So I avoided it. It does get your attention when you're looking at a gun that's aimed at you.
Well, that's interesting. But anyhow, I've got to ask about your background. Have you joined the Orange Revolution or something?
Me?
Yes.
Why?
You're orange.
Oh, my ancestors were Orangemen, but not in the Ukrainian sense. What's that you're asking?
Well, have either of you seen Oliver Stone's movie on Ukraine?
No.
I want to. It's in my queue, but I just haven't had time yet.
I watched it for the very first time last night, and I have to say I was very pleasantly surprised. It's probably my favorite Oliver Stone since JFK. He basically places what's going on squarely on the shoulders of George Soros, which I thought for a Hollywood mega guy was pretty amazing. So, Sam, if you're not part of the Orange Revolution, what are you thinking about Ukraine these days? I mean, you took a strong pro-Putin position a couple of weeks ago. Has anything changed your mind?
Well, I'm in favor of both the Russian and the Ukrainian people. I'm in favor of these two people who are virtually identical twins getting along. And I think it's very sad that it's been brought to this situation in which these people who must get along and ought to get along because they are blood of their blood and skin of their skin, and who share most of their history, their religion, their language. I am upset that the troublemakers, chief of which stands the United States, have worked to sow bitterness between these people. So that's my position. And I want a real Ukrainian government. From what I read about the so-called Ukrainian government in Kiev, it sounds very much like the so-called Hungarian government under Bela Kun in Hungary. There almost weren't any Hungarians in that government, and there sure are a lot of non-Ukrainians in the government in Ukraine.
It sounds like the United States and the West is never going to allow that to happen, though, and now Russia is not going to allow it to happen either. It's always going to be a vassal state for either the East or the West.
Yeah. What do you think? I mean, how is this going to play out? Will Ukraine be partitioned, or there's no hope of restoring neutrality?
I don't think so. I mean, it looks to me like there was a neutral government in 2014, and the United States and the CIA backed a coup against that government. And ever since, it's been firmly in the hands of, Western NATO-backed puppets. And I think Putin looks at that and he wants the opposite situation now. He wants to install a puppet of his own. And it's sad for the Ukrainian people, but they're stuck in the middle of perhaps the most contested territory outside of the Middle East in the entire world.
Is there
no reason why they should not be able to get along? There's no reason why Ukrainians and Russians should fight against each other. They ought to be natural trading partners, and they should get along at least as well as the Canadians, the Anglo-Canadians and the Anglo-Americans do. My fear is that this war will accentuate an anti-Russian Ukrainian nationalism. I don't know how Putin's going to get out of it. I don't know how, when you go into somebody's country, as we saw in Iraq, you're not greeted like we're told our GIs were greeted in Paris by girls kissing them and stuff. People don't like strangers coming into their country. And I don't know how he will get out. Any kind of government that succeeds, he can't, in good sense, settle with a treaty with the existing government because that government won't keep the treaty. He's got to replace this hostile government with one that will get along with Russia. But that government's going to have a hard time getting support from the Ukrainian people after a war. And it'll be even worse if he detaches the Donbass region from Ukraine. One thing that argues in favor of good relations is that there's so many Russians in Ukraine for whom Russian hating will be a hard sell for a government. But you take Donbass out, then that reduces the strength of the Russian element in Ukraine.
I think what Zelensky is doing is really just making the future of that region, very, very dangerous and uncertain. Because, I mean, it's clear that Russia is eventually going to win, whether they have a stable government in place there in Ukraine or not is an open question. But the longer that the war drags on by this pointless resistance, the more people that are going to die, and not only does it have immediate consequences, but the more people die, the harder the feelings are going to become between the Ukrainians and the Russians, and then more difficult it will be to make peace. I don't know what kind of delusional mindset is pushing Zelensky to fight the Russians like it is a war of extermination that they are waging. You know, it's not like that. I don't think Putin even really wanted to exert that much control over most of Ukraine. I mean, it might not be right from their perspective that he's violating their sovereignty and so forth, but it's just part of the unfortunate reality that they're concerned about their national security interests. It's not much different than us being concerned about the nuclear warheads being placed in Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Russians have their own concerns about these biolabs and so forth. So it's an ugly situation. The Ukrainians are being victimized, but I think that the tough thing is they got to understand that there's a reason why Russia's doing this, because they're being manipulated by the West into antagonizing their powerful neighbors to the north.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, you asked why Zelensky is doing it, and it seemed pretty obvious that when you've got Joe Biden and Boris Johnson basically saying, we'll give you something close to a carte blanche, I mean, he's got to be feeling like he has to do this to basically to maintain his position in history, if nothing else, because I mean, today Biden offers basically another, or appropriates, I don't know whatever happened to Congress having the spending power. Sam can comment about that if he wants, but Biden just said, I'm going to give 800 million, which is 200 million less than $1 billion, an extra 800 million to the Ukraine. And when somebody offers you that kind of money, it must inflate your ego a little bit and make you think, well, I've got to spend it. I've got to use it, and they want me to use it basically the way Britain used the Lend-Lease money in 1940 and 41 to fuel a war that they might have otherwise settled with Germany. True or false?
Well, I think you're right. It is not a helpful or wise policy to encourage small nations that adjoin larger nations to be antagonistic toward their neighbor. But ever since World War II, or before that with Poland, that's been the Churchillian, Rooseveltian, and American foreign policies, that you encourage countries like Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and Poland, and Ukraine to adopt hostile attitudes towards the Russians. And this is not good. Small nations have to get along with their neighbors. And if they would, and I think Ukraine could have done that. If they'd had a sensible president who's a genuine Ukrainian instead of Zelensky, this issue would never have come up. But Jason was saying he didn't understand what Zelensky's accomplishing by this pointless resistance. I mean, I understand. I don't think he gives a damn about the Ukrainian people. I don't think he thinks he is a Ukrainian. I think he's happy to sow ill will between different Christian European peoples in Europe. I think he's getting just what he wants.
Sam, what do you think about the fact that the historical ancestry of the Ashkenazi people is so heavily tied to that region? I think it was like during the heyday of the Soviet Union, 30% of all Jews around the world lived in Russia, and the vast majority of those lived in Ukraine and Belarus. And this is sort of like a secondary issue, because clearly the NATO Russia tension is the primary issue here. But one thing that I noticed is there's definitely a tendency in the Jewish community to view Ukraine as a very important territory because of the ancestral ties. And it even seems to go into events that were playing out around the Trump impeachment and Russiagate, because when you saw the individuals who were testifying against Trump at his impeachment, which had to do with the phone call that Trump had between himself and Ukrainian President Zelensky about prosecuting, Biden, Hunter, and Joe over corruption that was going on in that country. So just about all, over 90% of the people who testified against Trump were Jewish. And not only that, they were connected to Ukraine in one way or the other. You had Colonel Vendman, who is a Ukrainian Jew. You had, who was it, Yanukovych, the Ukrainian U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. And you had Gordon Sondland, the United States ambassador to the EU, all Jewish with connections and keen interest in this Ukraine territory. So do you think that this is an important aspect of it, or am I just barking up the wrong tree?
Well, I think that they are interested, but I don't think that they're interested in it because of any kind of sentimental tie to Ukraine. These are people who move across borders very happily throughout their history. And I don't think they feel any connection to Ukraine. One of the remarkable sub-stories of this set of events has been the transformation of Ukrainians from Nazis into noble freedom fighters. I read a considerable amount of Jewish media, and I've been used to, as you have, and I'm sure Charles has, to reading articles about how the Ukrainians are an anti-Semitic people, and they were Hitler's collaborators, and they helped commit the massacres at Babi Yar and this sort of thing. All of a sudden, the system has flipped a switch, and the evil Nazi Ukrainians that we were hearing about a few years ago are now noble freedom fighters. National Public Radio even had a program on that yesterday afternoon, which they had a Jew explain why he had come to realize that the Ukrainians were not Nazis. And as with most of this crazy liberal propaganda, it had nothing to do with the issue at all. It was a personal anecdote involving his mother and how he and his mother found out that 3 Ukrainians had helped hide his grandfather and his mother's half-sister during the German occupation. Well, that doesn't tell you anything about, doesn't, quote, exonerate, end quote, Ukrainians. It's just a story, much like the George Floyd incident was an anecdote without statistical evidence. But anyway, what was of interest in that story was that he talked about what his mother's memories before the coming of the Nazis, and they were of a country that was, in his words, idyllic. That she had this wonderful, happy life from her birth in 1920 until the German invasion in 1941, a life spent going down to the river and taking strolls with her boyfriends and having picnics and all this sort of thing. Well, that was not the experience of the Ukrainian people under the Soviet occupation. Their lives of real Ukrainians was not idyllic. I think it's pretty clear why townspeople in that town sought to attack his mother's half-sister and his grandfather, because for them, life had been idyllic precisely because they were living off the misery of the Ukrainian people and turning it to their own profit. But I don't think they feel any sentimental attachment at all. I think they just sense an opportunity to sow division, and they've always hated Russia. Russia has always been a major focal point of their hatred. A lot of people don't know it, but even before, well before the Russian Revolution, the American Jewish community was trying to influence our foreign policy. They tried to get President Taft not to renew our commercial treaty with Tsarist Russia. And he refused to do it and said that the treaty was good for American business and workers. And Jacob Schiff, who achieved even greater fame later on as one of the financiers of communism, describes in his autobiography that he told Taft that this is the end of your presidency. And they set out, they ran Theodore Roosevelt, a certifiable fool, and split the vote and put Wilson in. So they've been working their hatred and antagonism toward Russia for a long, long time. And they certainly are disenchanted with Russia now that it's no longer a communist and has reverted to sort of a Slavonophile Russian Orthodox past.
I seem to have run into the articles in the New York Times and other publications that the estimate that 6 million Jews either had died or were going to die was originally framed against Tsarist Russia.
I think the 6 million figure did come up. I'm not sure. I don't think it has the significance that a lot of people think it does. I don't know. You meet a lot of very cranky people cranks who are involved who fish in these waters, and a lot of them are unreliable. I think the problem is simply can be seen by common sense that they are adversarial to the societies in which they live. That's how they have survived for 25 centuries while dispersed among other peoples. You can't survive unless you're hostile toward the community in which you live.
Even though the comparisons between Putin and Hitler are obviously totally outrageous and false, there are a lot of strange echoes of World War II in this conflict, in that you have a number of people on either side who are identifying either with Nazis or with communists. And I think that what I've heard from people who have taken the Ukrainian side is that is part of what the tensions are between the two people. Because for us, we look at them and we say, well, there's really no difference between the Ukrainians and the Russians, although supposedly the biolabs there are crafting race-based pathogens which can distinguish between the two groups, the Ukrainians and the Russians. At least that's the allegation that the Russians were making. But what I've heard is that a lot of the Ukrainians blame the Russians for the Holodomor. They were the primary casualties of that genocide. And then on the other hand, there's deep anti-German, anti-Nazi sentiment in Russia because of how many Russian soldiers died fighting the Germans during World War II. And so it's a pretty complicated mixture there. And then of course there's the Azov people with Ukraine who are going around with the Sonnenrads and other symbology used by the Nazis in World War II. But then people are accusing the Wagner mercenary group with the Russians of having Nazi sympathies. And then finally, I've seen Russian soldiers, not officially, mind you, but they're going around in formation carrying communist flags. So it's a very bizarre mixture there, isn't it?
Well, yeah, they like friction between peoples, and it was a great tragedy that this friction arose between the German and Russian peoples, who historically have gotten along very well. World War I and World War II were not the normal story in Slavic German relations. Germans and Russians have usually hit it off on an individual level better than Anglo-Saxons and Russians, and better than French and Russians. And they have a naturally complementary role to play with each other. But with the coming of Soviet communism, which sought to impose its will on all of Europe, this necessarily brought Germany into conflict with the Soviet Union, and things were very, the brutality of that war was just catastrophic for everybody. But it was much like Ukraine and Russia. The outsiders like to cultivate ill will between our peoples.
Do either of you guys think that there is a valid comparison between the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the aggression of the North against the South during the American Civil War? Or do you think that is not an inapt comparison?
No, I don't think it's that. I think it's a very different thing. There are comparisons. There are two comparisons that thoughtful Americans should consider. One you mentioned, which is the fact that we did the exact same thing with Cuba that Russia is doing in regard to Ukraine. We had our Monroe Doctrine, which said that we did not want hostile people acquiring bases on our borders. And in pursuance of that, when we found out that missiles had been, Soviet missiles were in Cuba, we threw a blockade around them and were preparing to invade them, to wage a war on them the way Putin has on Ukraine. And everything that they said about Cuba, you say now about Ukraine, we said about Cuba. It was a sovereign country, entitled to choose its own allies. It was entitled to station missiles on its soil. But we wouldn't put up with that because our national security was in jeopardy. And it's an exact parallel, as you pointed out, Jason, to what Putin has done in Ukraine. Another parallel would be to look at the difference between the American reaction to the Hungarian revolt in 1956 and the American reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine now. When the Hungarians overthrew Soviet rule, the United States behind the scenes moved decisively to try to reimpose Soviet communism on Hungary. Eisenhower sent a telegram to Tito, certainly knowing that it would be shared with Moscow, saying that it was the policy of the United States government to oppose the creation of governments on the borders of the Soviet Union hostile to the Soviet Union. Eisenhower sent that during a brief period of time in which the Hungarian army and the Hungarian people had driven the Soviet tanks back out of Budapest, and the Soviets were trying to decide what to do. So Eisenhower basically said, go get them. We don't want a non-communist Hungary. The Hungarians were pleading for anti-tank weapons. Rather than ship weapons to the Hungarians like we're doing to the Ukrainians, the United States not only refused to send them any aid, the United States threatened the puppet government of Germany that we had installed, that if they allowed anti-tank guns or any kind of munitions to go to the Hungarians, they would pay for it. Franco offered to send anti-tank guns, but his plane needed to refuel in Germany. Adenauer agreed to allow that, and Eisenhower peremptorily ordered both of them to stand down, that there would be no anti-tank guns for the Hungarians. So that was a very different reaction towards a Soviet invasion of Hungary, as opposed to what we're doing now.
And one of the saddest things, one of the saddest documents of the 20th century is the transcript of some of those last radio pleas going out from the freedom fighters in Budapest to the West, and we just, or the Americans primarily, just completely threw them under the bus. As Sam says, for a very, very different scenario.
Yeah, we actively assisted the Soviet aggression. We should never call it the Russian. They like to say now the Russians invaded Budapest. None of this stuff was done by the Russians. It's done by the Soviets. It's like the famine in Ukraine. That was not done by Russians. It was done by non-Russians who were running in Russia and Ukraine, and it was done in Russia too. The same policies were pursued in Russia against Russian peasant farmers that were pursued in Ukraine against Ukrainian farmers. But the U.S. had a completely different attitude towards Hungary. Henry Kissinger later on, who was of course not in the State Department in 1956 when Eisenhower turned the Hungarians back over to Soviet rule. But he later on, to show what a wise and astute statesman he was, he said that Hungary was of no interest to America whatsoever in defending our allowing the Soviets to reimpose their control in 56. So Kissinger viewed them with just total contempt. And he expressed the views of the American, quote, elite, end quote, running the government in Washington, people like Eisenhower and Dulles.
Would Putin have invaded Ukraine if Trump was still the president?
Who knows? Trump seems to be a very volatile figure.
He's good with the strongmen, though, isn't he? He knows how to flatter their egos.
Well, I don't know. He got elected president. I barely could get elected president of the Optimist Club in Atlanta. So who am I to judge him?
Do you think that the obvious weakness and mental decline of Joe Biden is causing China and Russia to feel like it's their time now or never to strike and grab the brass ring, take Taiwan, take Ukraine, start setting some of the oil purchases to the yuan instead of the dollar, that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Before we go too much further, I just wanted to say thank you, Paul, for joining us. And do you know Jason Kessler? Jason Kessler, do you know Paul? I don't know if you all have been introduced properly before.
Hi, Paul. No, I haven't met Paul before, but I've heard him on James Edwards' program on the political cesspool.
Well, you can see me down at the local post office. There's usually a sign wanted.
Anyhow, Jason Kessler, Paul Frederick Fromm, Jason is best known for things that he doesn't want to talk about tonight. He doesn't want to talk about Charlottesville 101, and so I had said, well, eventually we want to do a Charlottesville Advanced Graduate Seminar 707, but I don't know if today is the day for that. He said he's desperate to talk about other things. So, but
there's lots to talk about.
We can still slip in a few questions about Charlottesville if somebody really wants to.
Well, I wanted to comment on something that Jason was saying about the alleged alliance between Russia and China. We have to keep in mind that Russia and China are natural enemies. Russia is the guardian of the gates of our people against China taking over Siberia and overrunning Russia itself. Russia keeps the Asiatic race in Asia, and China wants to take over Siberia. So there is a fundamental that it may be that there's a brief flirtation of the moment, but in general, their policies are going to be hostile to each other. And Russia is our natural ally against, as Europeans, it's our natural ally. It's all of Europe's natural ally. But once again, you see the governments of the United States and Europe acting against the interests of the European peoples.
It is just catastrophic, pushing Russia closer to Red China from the point of view of the European people. This is madness. But what has impressed me so far is the near unanimity among white nationalists on this issue about the conflict in the Ukraine with Russia. That basically Russia has some legitimate demands, and provided they recognize Ukrainian independence, those demands should be met, and the peace could be reestablished. But apart from that, which I find very encouraging, people, who, as far as I know, not consulted, like people I've spoken to at meetings, especially East Europeans, hardcore anti-communists, just like you and me, Sam, they're unanimous that Putin basically is in the right here. And on the other hand, the near total unanimity of the globalists, the mass media, all the talking heads, leaders and spokes thingies for all the parties, that this is a holy war and we must get into it, and maybe not actually into war, but do all we can, and completely blind to the to the corruption that's in the Ukraine, and I'm sure in Russia too, that we're cozying, that we're making as our fair-haired boy and cause célèbre somebody that maybe has been goaded into this by people like Newland and other globalists who encouraged him to be intransigent and to do what he is good at, and that is he's an actor. He's a like
an outrageous, disgusting actor at that.
well, he's like a vaudeville. He's like his type, his tribe, a vaudeville entertainer. He reminds me, especially with his piano playing gag of a few years ago, of the type of person that I'm told used to warm up the audience at burlesque houses before the girls came on. You tell some dirty jokes and do some slapstick and so on. And Zelensky reminds me of that, but our media is just slurping it up like a drunken old geezer in the front row.
Oh, they're in absolute lockstep. That's the remarkable thing about the American media. It does not require a Goebbels or a Stalin to bring about unanimity. They all know exactly, like ants know how to build a hive without anyone having to tell them how to do it. The prostitutes all know exactly what they're supposed to do. All of them.
A very sad thing happened today. I'm sure it has in the States too, but our government, through its licensing agency or regulatory agency, has now banned RT, Russia Today, and RT France from the networks in Canada on cable. And I've watched RT Today occasionally when I'm in a hotel, and it's a pretty good coverage. But what bothers me as a libertarian is we should at least have that voice.
You remember how the American press unanimously eviscerated Tucker Carlson because he went to Budapest and did an interview of Orban, their head of state. Really, this is such a shocking thing. We have never ever heard Orban's side from any significant portion of the American media, and then they absolutely had their panties in a wad and worked themselves into a state of moral indignation. How dare someone interview Orban and have him explain himself to the American people? I would have liked to have seen somebody interview Pol Pot, and I watched the Barbara Walters interview of Fidel Castro when she did it. There was no outcry about that, but they don't want the slightest opposition in the media.
It's a totally different game now with regards to. It's a totally different game now with regards to free speech and having different voices. And the banning of RT has been something that's concerned me as well, because the justification is, they call them state-sponsored media, and they put labels on RT social media accounts. Now they're banning it even on traditionally free speech social media platforms like Telegram. Which don't ban white nationalists, don't ban like radical Muslims. So it's been a place that even groups that are considered more radical can still enjoy free speech. But the justification is, that they're saying RT is propaganda, but it's not as if people are experiencing RT in the West as one would in a totalitarian regime where all you get is the state media. They're one voice among many, and in fact, they're the only dissenting voice really that is opposing the Western narrative of the situation. And what I've seen is that every major event since Charlottesville, the January 6th event, the trucker protest in Canada, and now this has been used as an escalation of censorship and left-wing authoritarianism. So the Overton window of what's allowable has been shrinking and shrinking. And I should also include COVID in that. You can't doubt the COVID narrative. You can't doubt the Russian narrative. You can't doubt the trucker, the Canadian government's version of the trucker narrative, and on and on and on. It's very scary because it doesn't seem like there are any brakes on that train.
I think you make a very good point about that. I haven't watched enough RT to agree or disagree with the idea that they are a mouthpiece for the Russian government. They probably have a window of things that they can't touch. But I found the coverage that I did watch pretty good of world politics. But let's not kid ourselves that our own media, our communist, I mean, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is state funded, you don't get dissenting views. You don't get truckers with their point of view on. You don't get, our populist party, the People's Party of Canada, and Maxime Bernier. His comments won't appear. And so there is a very narrow window of what you'll hear. You won't hear any serious critic of immigration unless the criticism is from the left saying we need more, we need more, we need more. And I would say the same. I religiously watch CNN because I've got a masochistic streak and I like drinking poison. There's so little real diversity there. They're all basically chattering pretty much the same stuff.
Well, here's an example of state-funded.
Was nonstop hate Trump for 4 years.
Here's an example of the state-sponsored media in America. The National Public Radio derives a significant amount of money support from the United States government, from the taxpayers. It's not as great as it was, but it's still a big chunk. And it was public tax money that provided all their licenses, their stations, and everything else. I don't know of a single Trump supporter who works anywhere in National Public Radio, in any local station, anything. It's just nonstop propaganda. And when it came to the civil war in Syria, I listened almost every day to National Public Radio's All Things Considered. I have heard over the last 10 years, maybe 700 or 800 interviews with people in Syria. About once every couple of weeks, they had, maybe once a week, they have somebody that they interview in Syria. Every single time, it's been somebody with the so-called Free Syrian Army, giving only a first name. I have never, ever heard a single interview with anybody in Syria supporting Assad. Now, obviously, a large number of people in Syria have to be supporting him or he wouldn't be there. But the American people have never been allowed to hear their point of view ever, to my experience with National Public Radio. And these are the people who have the gall to talk about Russia Today being a state-sponsored propaganda medium. Do these people even own mirrors, Paul? Do you think they own them? Do they ever look at themselves in the mirror?
I think the mirrors are fractured. Well, I'm an expert on the Middle East. I was in Syria for 1 day. I was in Lebanon for a week. That's another story. But okay. But my own take on this is the West. The people in the West have been given an absolutely simple-minded, cardboard villain picture of Bashar al-Assad. If Assad was removed and replaced by the Free Syrians or some other ISIS or Al-Qaeda affiliate, his dissenting Muslim minority, the Alawites, would be wiped out. The Christians would be wiped out, just as in Iraq. One of the genius accomplishments of Bush the first and Bush the second was getting rid of the protector of the Christians, which was Saddam Hussein. I mean, he may not have been your kind of Democrat, but he did protect people we claim to be wanting to see protected. The Middle East is a lot more complicated than just the stereotypical public broadcasting. Good guys and bad guys. We're the good guys. They're the bad guys.
Well, you took the words out of my mouth, and I like to point out to people, especially the evangelical supporters of Bush, that Bush II achieved what 14 centuries of Muslim persecution did not achieve. He managed to destroy the Christian community of Iraq that has been there for almost 2 millennia. George Bush can put that on his resume, that he was the guy that accomplished what Muslims were unable to accomplish. And all over the Middle East, the Christians want us to stay out. and all over the, like you were saying in Syria. The Assad government is strongly supported by the considerable Christian minority in Syria. And if that government falls to these Muslim fanatics that we call the Free Syrian Army, the result is not going to be some kind of Switzerland or Denmark like National Public Radio claims. It's going to be a theocratic, anti-Christian state, and all these people will have to leave their homes and leave their countries. But no one, the only power on earth that cares about the Christian minority in the Middle East is, who are they, Paul? Russia. Yeah, Putin. He's the only one that cares about the Christian minorities in the Middle East. And that's another reason why he has to go. If Putin would become like Angela Merkel, who was described by the New York Times as being more American than the Americans, a role model to Americans, if he would allow Muslims and third world people to colonize his country, if he would allow the Chinese to come in and colonize it and bring Muslims in, if he would do the things that Angela Merkel does, he would be hailed as a great hero.
There's something
that's why we hate him. He's not doing what Angela is doing. That's why he and Orban have to go.
Speaking of Merkel, it reminds me of a Facebook posting that came out a few hours ago from County Donegal in Ireland, and the first plane load or shipment of refugees from the Ukraine are a well scrubbed African family, and the comments.
Yes, the Ukrainian government has allowed these people to come to Ukraine, and a high percentage of the quote Ukrainians end quote who are leaving the country to go to better climates in Germany now they can get in as Ukrainian refugees are in fact third world people of color. No wonder we love Ukraine. No wonder we hate Putin.
They don't want to fight for Ukraine.
I'm not talking about the American
as
people. I'm talking about the government that misrules and oppresses us.
They fundamentally don't see themselves as Ukrainians, do they? I mean, a number of these Africans were interviewed by the media at the border. They're rushing to get out, and people are saying, "Why don't you want to fight?" And they say, "Look at me. I'm a black person. I'm not a Ukrainian."
Exactly. And ironically, they get it. Apparently, at least a couple of incidents on the Polish border, the Poles pushed them aside and said, "No, we're dealing with Ukrainians."
Well, Paula, you've had a lot of experience with Ukrainians. Canada has a very large Ukrainian population. I used to go speak to the Ukrainian club in Atlanta that had maybe 60 or 70 members. So my contact with them has been limited. My impression has always been that Ukrainians were fine people, are fine people. What I'm puzzled at is how they were induced to elect this non-Ukrainian Zelensky and his to be head of their state and allowed him to fill the government with other non-Ukrainians. I just can't imagine how they have forgotten what they suffered at the hands of these people when these people were running the Soviet Union. Do you have any thoughts about that? Have you talked to the Ukrainians in Canada about that?
Well, not. I've had some heated discussions on email. On email and Facebook with a couple of the Ukrainians I know. Yes, there's the largest diaspora of Ukrainians in the world in Canada after Russia. So we've got about 1.4 million who trace themselves to the Ukraine. I think they are at some remove from what's going on, and so there's a natural gravitation to the homeland. Our homeland's under attack, and we're on their side, and that's completely understandable. But you might ask how it was that your neocons and Soros and the globalists managed to foist this Zelensky on the Ukraine. Apparently, he won an election, and he's filled his cabinet with, as being reported, people who are not really Ukrainian. It'd be like if there were two Chinamen and a Spaniard and 3 or 4 people from Gabon, the people of the American cabinet, but they're Americans.
Well, the majority of people who vote in elections aren't really high information people, though, are they? They're the kind of low information normies who watch a TV show where a silly actor plays president on TV. And then if he runs for president, they think, hey, I think that guy would make a great president. I saw him on TV.
What
Well,
about the
that's true,
senile
Jason.
guy?
That's the way democracy works, but in America. But Ukrainians, I've known quite a few. I probably have known 40 or 50 of them in my life. I've never met one of them yet that did not understand who ran communism and the fact that these people are hostile to Ukrainians. I just can't imagine how they elected this Zelensky unless there was a massive vote fraud, which wouldn't surprise me either.
Yeah, we don't get speaking about control, we don't get much dissenting information out of the Ukraine. It's all, Zelensky's great. The people are fighting bravely and resourcefully, and things are so bad with the Russian missiles and bombs and so on. We get one standard pattern. I don't think I've seen a single dissent from within the Ukraine since the hostilities began, almost a month ago. We may not be getting the full picture any more than people in Europe would be getting the full picture of what's going on in Canada or the United States if all they saw was CNN or its Canadian equivalent.
You really have to be on your guard during times of war, because the information that you're receiving is so faulty, it's so manipulated, and we're seeing that on a whole other level with what's going on in Ukraine. I mean, it was happening in Syria, where there were allegations of Assad gassing his own people, which were later debunked, but they were trying to get people's emotions up to rile them up for war. And now in Ukraine, it was just really a blitzkrieg of creating these fake propaganda pieces, at first about the heroic Ghost of Kiev, a legendary fighter pilot who is shooting down Russians out of the sky but doesn't actually exist, taking attractive Ukrainian women and posing them with airsoft guns and saying, well, look, even the women of Ukraine are bravely standing up against the Russians. And now, of course, they've moved on to accusing the Russians daily of the horrible Russians are bombing a school, they're bombing a hospital. And the problem with that is, you hear something like that and you think, of course, that's terrible. Why would they bomb the sick? Why would they bomb children? But then as one of, I guess, the minority of people who tries to also follow the Russian side, they're making accusations that the Ukrainians are using these type of emotionally manipulative locations to stage their militias, so that if the Russians attack the people who are attacking them, they get accused of war crimes. So it's a complicated situation. The fog of war is there, and all of the information we're getting is coming from biased sources who are translating a language that most of us don't understand. It's a very difficult situation.
One thing that is very remarkable, Jason, involves the American people, and that pains me as an American. Do Americans also not have a mirror? We know people like Zelensky apparently are not mirror people. They can't ever look at themselves in the mirror. But I've seen the stuff you're talking about in the New York Times, the Atlanta Journal, and listened to it on National Public Radio. This tremendous moral indignation that the Russians have killed over 1,000 civilians, which in reality tells you they're trying not to kill civilians. But I would think a nation that has to its, quote, credit, end quote, the atomic bomb being dropped in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the firebombing of Hamburg, to some extent the bombing of Dresden, the terror bombings all across Germany that killed 2 million civilians that were deliberately targeted at civilians with bombing plans designed to bomb areas so as to seal off escape exits, so as to kill as many civilians as possible. I think that nation should keep its mouth shut when the subject of civilian casualties come up? Don't you think that America really should just shut up and let other nations talk about that?
Yeah, I really appreciate what you're saying there. Our mutual friend David Irving, early on in his career, did a great book about Dresden, and I think the more or less accepted figures these days is that in a 36-hour period, over 300,000 civilians were killed, most of them roasted to death. That the purpose of that bombing, as Churchill said, was to we're going to baste the people. It was not a military target. It had no military significance at all. It was a cultural center and a catchment for refugees fleeing the Soviet armies to the east. It was deliberate mass murder of civilians. My query is, if only approximately 100 Ukrainian children have been killed so far, and perhaps 1,000 civilians, that's not much of a war. Not that I wish anybody, a child or adult, to be killed as a civilian. That's not it at all. But this falls a little short of mass annihilation of people, as in this instances you've cited, like the complete annihilation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Incidentally, Nagasaki was the largest Christian center in Japan. Why would it be chosen?
Pretty odd, isn't it? Pretty odd that of all the cities in Japan, our experts in the Pentagon, who would have to be pretty well versed about the internal affairs of Japan, chose the one city in Japan with a sizable Christian minority. Now, that's really odd, isn't it?
If the stated reason really was we've got to force them to sign the peace treaty so we don't have to fight house to house as they did in Iwo Jima, and probably 1 million casualties. If that was the purpose, there could have been nearly uninhabited islands or uninhabited islands.
Absolutely.
And you drop a nuclear bomb on them, and there's this great mushroom cloud, and they can see, okay, the Americans have got a bigger stick than we have. We'd better end it. Although the reality was Japan was on the verge of surrendering anyway before Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But that mass killing of civilians, I guess, to make a point, and I agree. You're crabbing about, or
it's worse than the madam of the town whorehouse showing up at tea with the ladies and wanting to talk about sexual morality and chastity. The madam, if she's allowed to have tea with decent women, keeps her mouth shut when that subject comes up. And the United States should keep its mouth shut about this subject. We don't have the cards to play that game.
Well, and there's the question of whether the current weapons programs of the United States are still a threat to innocent people, because the Russians are making these accusations that there are these bio labs in Ukraine. Of course, the United States government is denying it, but they've been very inconsistent in their messaging. First saying there was no bio labs, and then Victoria Nuland from the United States government has admitted that we have those. Then they changed it to say that, well, they were really just dismantling Soviet era pathogens, but they've been doing it for 17 years. Why is it taking 17 years? And then the director of that program, was quoted on Tucker Carlson as saying, that they weren't actually dismantling these pathogens. They were using them for studies, because that's the kind of thing that scientists do. And I would point out that in our very recent history, we still have unresolved questions about the United States role in funding the Wuhan Institute, where it was very likely the coronavirus might have been created and escaped from. So there are serious questions about what the United States was doing in those biolabs. The Russians themselves have accused the Americans of funding research on the coronavirus, creating new strains of the coronavirus, creating race-based pathogens, which could specifically target the Russian people and be carried by migratory geese north into Russia. So it's a very real possibility that there are serious war crimes and deadly experiments going on in Ukraine at the behest of the United States government.
For the sake of trying to talk to people, I think it's best that we confine ourselves to things that are undeniably true. You know, we don't know what the case is with these biological weapons and labs, but we know without any doubt what the United States did in Cuba in 1962, and how it is a perfect parallel to what Putin has done in Ukraine. We know what Eisenhower did with the Hungarians in 1956 in not supporting their bid for freedom, not supplying them with weapons, threatening European nations that offered to provide them with weapons. The complete opposite of what we're doing to Russia now that Russia is non-communist. We know so many things. We know that the nation that now struts around the UN proclaiming its devotion to historic national borders, what was that nation doing 20 years ago in Serbia? In the case of Serbia and Kosovo, where it was a case of driving Christians out of what is now majority Muslim Kosovo, the United States had no respect for national boundaries. The United States ordered the Serbs to get out of Kosovo, which has been part of their territorial limits for I don't know, 600, 800, 900 years. And we didn't give a fig about their boundaries. And when the Serbs refused to do it, we attacked Serbia. We began massive bombardment with our air force of Serbia. So these three things are undeniably true. And any decent American who looks at that is going to realize that we're being lied to by our government. Our government does not represent the American people. It doesn't represent them at home, and it doesn't change its spots when it goes overseas. And as a Southerner, that's something that bothers me, that Southerners, who more than any other element in the American people, should despise the American government and understand how malevolent and ill-spirited it is. They are the first to support that government in its aggressive actions overseas because they somehow imagine that the government that hates them at home is their friend when it goes abroad. It's not. Our policies toward Serbia and Kosovo, or Hungary in 1956, or Russia today are consistent. They're consistently anti-Christian. They're consistently anti-white. They're consistently anti-European. They're as consistently consisting of those things as do the domestic policies here in America. And why can't the basic core demographic element, the founding stock of America, the Southern white people of America, why can't they see that? But what is wrong with them?
General Wesley Clark, who was deeply involved in that campaign against Serbia, said at the time that a nation in modern Europe, a nation can simply not be allowed to be, I think he said, ethnically based. Serbia wanted Serbia and the surrounding Serb majority areas to be united, and that absolutely appalled him. And he's been taken out of the old folks' home, and he's a regular now on CNN pontificating.
He also is half Israeli. I believe he qualifies with his mother for Israeli citizenship. And the United States government has never had the slightest problem in the world with an ethnicity-based citizenship in Israel. We've had no problems with it. We've had no problems with them building a wall that the American people are paying for. We've had you and I can't move to Israel, but they want Africans and Chinese to be able to move to Hungary and Poland and Germany and Ukraine and Russia. And when someone like Orban or Putin comes along and says, no, I want to preserve my nation, the United States can't stand it. The ruling element in America will not tolerate that. They'll back it in Israel, but they're not going to tolerate it for white Europeans anywhere.
A comical thing about General Clark, somewhat after his military career, he launched an ill-fated run for I think it was the Democratic nomination. It didn't go very far, but partway into that run, he discovered he was Jewish.
I like to joke we've had two foreign-born Jewish secretaries of state in the last 50 or so years. We had Henry Kissinger, we had Madeleine Albright. And I get all of this wild stuff from the right-wing extremists, a lot of which I know is just goofiness. But I was reading stuff put out by the evil right-wing extremists and all that years before, saying that Madeleine Albright was Jewish, and they even had the names of her parents and where they lived and the city in Czechoslovakia where they came from and what synagogue they went to. And I was reading this stuff. About 5 years later, Madeleine Albright revealed that she had just found out that she was Jewish and not Episcopalian. I like to joke with people that by one of the advantages of living in this sort of underground is that we knew that she was Jewish 5 years before Madeleine Albright knew she was Jewish.
I saw an article in the Jerusalem Times, which was talking about how a lot of the so-called Russian oligarchs are Jewish and have dual citizenship in Israel. And so there's a flood of these Russian Jewish oligarchs moving to Israel and taking their money with them.
No. The thing that amused me about Madeleine Albright is she was, well up there in power before apparently she finally realized, and she stated that she was Jewish. And I thought, can anybody take these people seriously? I mean, that should have been enough.
They should be taken. They're very dangerous people. They should be taken very seriously. They have, you remember her remark, that gentle lady, about the fact that 250,000 Iraqi children had died as a result of our sanctions. And she just contemptuously dismissed the death of 250,000 children by starvation. She had nothing but contempt for them.
Yeah,
she should be taken very seriously. A woman like that is entitled to be taken extremely seriously. But my question remains, and I really do seek the three of you to answer it. What is wrong with the American people that they go on being deceived by these war stories over and over again? Whether it's the little babies that we were told that Saddam Hussein had piled up in the maternity hospital in Kuwait and forced the mothers at gunpoint to watch the little babies die of starvation, or the weapons of mass destruction, or the Tonkin Gulf resolution. It's just one, the Lusitania, remember the Maine, the Southerners have fired on Fort Sumter for no reason. It's just lie after lie after lie. And every reasonably literate person in America knows that it's lie after lie after lie. And yet they always believe the new lie, and they're always ready to support these policies of their government. I'm seriously asking the question, what do you think causes this, especially among Southerners? What is the diagnosis?
I don't know about especially among Southerners, but I think that the art of propaganda is pretty scientific. I mean, it's tested in laboratories just like any other sciences. There extreme amounts of money spent on polling firms and doing focus groups to basically understand how to manipulate people. And it's a weakness of our human nature and how our brains work that we are susceptible to something like that. And propaganda is perhaps the most powerful weapon there is, more powerful than any gun or any bomb, because when you live in a world where there are so many democracies, you control the people, you control the power if you control the art of propaganda.
Well, when you said we, I think it's not the general we, it's white Europeans. I see two things at work. Number one, part of our survival strategy involved protecting the weak. So market yourself as weak, as a victim. The kids, or that classic picture, which was staged, incidentally, a few years back, I guess 2015, of that kid on a Turkish beach. He apparently he drowned trying to sneak into the Zephyr, I think it's called the Zephyr, the boat trying to sneak into Greece, capsized, blah, blah, blah. There he is on the beach, still in his shorts, and the poor kid drowned. Well, boo-hoo-hoo. Well, that really had a big impact in Canada. So that's one way that what is a strength for us can be exploited as a weakness. The other thing is, and I may be wrong about this, but to answer Sam's particular question, what is it about white Southerners? We've had pride in ourselves almost beaten out of us or guilted out of us. The idea that, well, yeah, sure, it's too bad about the kid, and theoretically, yeah, I'm sorry about it, but we have to take care of ourselves. You know, we've been told that we're essentially rotten or racist. We're just bad people. Anything that's gone wrong on Earth is our problem. And I guess Susan Sontag said the white race is the cancer of history. So, okay, to the extent that you've imbibed any of that, you're not thinking about, well, what's best for us. So you're very susceptible to the latest boo-hoo-hoo story. You know, the 97 Ukrainian kids who supposedly have died, or the kid on the beach in Turkey, or whatever. And then from there on, then the manipulation starts. We've got to do something about it.
Well, I'm still curious. I listen to what you say. With Southerners, I think it may be the Stockholm syndrome, or the abused child syndrome. They say abused children try to please their parents more than children who have normal parents. And Southerners, being abused children, want to please daddy in Washington and show that they're okay by running off to these wars against the Germans in World War I and World War II, and now all being enthusiastic about going after Putin. But there seems to be a qualitative difference between us as Americans and other people. You look at the Soviet Union. For 3 generations, there was brutal repression in the Soviet Union. During many epochs in that periods of that time, if you were found with an icon or a picture of the Tsar hidden in your closet, you'd be killed. You died often gruesome death. And yet, after 3 generations, when the first anti-communist demonstration was allowed in the Soviet Union, in Moscow, the National Public Radio and the New York Times in America ridiculed this upcoming demonstration, saying nobody was going to be there. People love communism. They're proud of the communist heritage of Russia. There'll only be a few cranks. Well, when the day came for this rally, which could only be advertised by handbills handed out in the city, 500,000 people marched through Red Square carrying portrait pictures of the Tsar, icons of the Tsar, and pictures of Lenin defaced with fangs and blood dripping down his face. Now, they maintained that through 3 generations of savage persecution. But I live in a people who are intimidated by the danger of not being invited to the cocktail party.
Well, when about 15 years ago, I toured the Museum of the Appalachians in Nashville. And something that really stuck with me was the a section there on the state of Tennessee, and it's called the volunteer state, right?
Yes.
Anyway, and they outlined how it per capita had made the biggest contribution to America's overseas wars. And I wonder if the manipulation there isn't the remainder of the remnant of the proud warrior spirit of the Confederacy. The Southerners fought harder, fought more bravely, fought better, but of course were eventually overwhelmed by larger and better financed forces, etc. But that warrior spirit transferred not to protecting the South, because Soviet Russia didn't threaten the South. National Socialist Germany didn't threaten the South. Hitler did not announce he was about to invade Charleston. There never was a threat. but why the great warrior spirit? And I wonder if it hasn't been in some way just nudged into where you can still be a warrior, but now you're a warrior for, I don't know, freedom or democracy or some such stuff, rather than yourself.
The Southern people have a very strong culture of patriotism and respect for the military. And I don't know that there are that many Southerners who really understand how we are being exploited with these foreign wars. I think it's changing a little bit, but there's really an unquestioning reverence for the United States and for the military. And I think historically, the white Southern people have, very strongly identified, this is my country. And so when people put out propaganda saying that there's, folks here or there who are threatening your country, they take that as a personal insult, and they want to go overseas to defend their country and their kin from whoever the United States government is telling them is the enemy at that point in time.
Why do they believe the American government when they know the American government is busing their children, taxing the hell out of them, colonizing their neighborhoods with foreigners, running propaganda schools that systematically denigrate them and preach hate against them, and condemn their historic ancestors, people like Lee and Washington and so on? Why do they believe that government? When everything they know about that government at home should tell them this government is not my friend and is untruthful.
Well, it comes back to the power of propaganda. It relates to, if you've ever read about the experience of American POWs in communist prison camps and the psychological programming that they endure, the psychological manipulation, the struggle sessions, and they break down your defenses, they break down your sense of identity. And the power of the media to broadcast that sort of propaganda simultaneously to millions of people makes it the most powerful and frightening weapon that's ever existed on the face of the earth, I think, because one of the few things that is worse than death is to lose yourself in a waking death. And that's what they've done to us with this sort of propaganda. People have a weakness, and they exploit good propaganda. It does exploit people's inherent goodness. People don't want to see themselves as hateful people. They don't want to see themselves as bad people. And so that's why guilt and shame is such a prominent feature in American propaganda. That's why people respond so viscerally to being called a racist or a hater of this stripe or that. But we're a broken people because of that propaganda, I think.
I agree.
Very interesting. I mean, I wanted to quote parts of a statute that just recently came to my attention from the state of California, of all places. It's California Government Code Section 127.5, and it was enacted in 1953, which you would think was at the height of the communist anti-Red Scare. It starts off, the legislature of California finds that there exists a worldwide revolutionary movement to establish a totalitarian dictatorship based on force and violence rather than upon law. This worldwide revolutionary movement is predicated upon and is designed and intended to carry into execution the basic precepts of communism as expounded by Marx, Lenin, and Stalin. Pursuant to the objectives of the world communist movement, in numerous foreign countries, the established governments have been overthrown. The successful establishment of totalitarian dictatorships has been consistently aided, accompanied, or accomplished by repeated acts of treachery, deceit, Within the boundaries of the state of California, there are active, disciplined communist organizations presently functioning for the primary purpose of advancing the objectives of world communist movement, which organizations promulgate, advocate, and adhere to the precepts and principles and doctrines of the World Communist Movement. These communist organizations are characterized by the identification of their programs, policies, and objectives with those of world communism. One of the objections of world communism movement is to place its members in state and local positions and in state-supported educational institutions. If this is 127.5E. If this objective is successful, propaganda can be disseminated by the members of these organizations among pupils and students, by the members who would have the opportunity to teach them, and to whom, as teachers, they would look for guidance, authority, and leadership. The members of such groups would use their positions to advocate and teach their doctrines and teach the prescribed Communist Party line, dogma, or doctrine without regard to truth or free inquiry. This type of propaganda is sufficiently subtle to escape detection. Now, a lot of people have been asking the question, was 1984 a warning or a guidebook? And I asked a question about this California statute. It is so precise about the methodology of communist infiltration, and yet California is the state that basically went communist first.
I would say New York went communist first.
Huh?
New York went communist long before California.
Right.
Almost half the members of the Soviet of St. Petersburg, or Petrograd as it was called at the time, lived in New York City when the Tsar abdicated. And they had to be put on a special boat and sent from New York City to the Soviet Union, where they took over and ran the government. Trotsky,
most notably,
was a New York boy.
Regardless of the race between the bi-coastal race for elite dominance, my point is everybody was aware of this, and yet it happened exactly according to plan. And part of the reason I think the difference between what you're saying about Russia and Russia's treasured memories of Christianity and the Tsar, and what happened in the United States and Western Europe is, again, the difference between 1984 and Brave New World.
Good point. Good point. And Brave New World is what's really won out in America, I think, more than 1984.
Absolutely, because basically sex, drugs, and rock and roll was the way that people were seduced into loving their oppression. And so I think that's kind of it. Freedom. I mean, you said a very interesting thing a couple of weeks ago, Sam. You said, and I had never heard it articulated this way, but you said that any country that began with the Declaration of Independence and that famous line, all men are created equal, that the current state of affairs was the inevitable result.
Yes.
Of time. And it was the pursuit of happiness is the doctrine of Brave New World.
Well, remember the word happiness at the time, it was already losing that meaning. It was a little antique. They considered not using happiness, but not to defend Jefferson, who wrote that horrible document. But the word happiness back then, much like the similar word in contemporary French, meant money, property. So it meant the pursuit of property. It didn't mean, la, 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 I'm going to be happy. I'm going to read my self-help book and go to the ashram and learn how to be happy. It meant pursuit of property. But the document itself is so bad. All men are created equal, of course, the worst. But the second thing, and are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. No. A Tibetan is not endowed with any unalienable rights. Neither is a Papuan in New Guinea. We were fighting for the rights of Englishmen, which were not some sort of philosophical whimsy. There were specific things that came out of 1,000 years plus of Anglo-Saxon history in England when we had our separation from our mother country. Our Bill of Rights is virtually taken from the template of the British Parliament's declaration, the English Parliament's Declaration of Right after the Glorious Revolution in 1689. Instead of saying we were fighting for the rights of that our ancestors won for us as Anglo-Saxons, we came with this goofy thing that everybody in the world has all these rights, that a Papuan has the same rights as a Prussian, and Prussian has the same rights as Anglo-Saxon. That's crazy too. And then you go down the list of the accusations they made against King George. Virtually every single one of them is a lie. They just lie after lie after lie after lie. And it doesn't give me any pleasure to say that. I don't have any ancestors that fought for the king in either the English Civil War in the 1640s or in the War for Independence. I'm descended from a general on the American side in the War for Independence. Like my father thought the revolution was a mistake. And I've always thought he was right, that it was a bad thing. And all these lies that they said against George III, who was a very, very kindly and restrained monarch who became the symbol of stability and order during the French Revolution. He was the symbol of that all over Europe. But I don't know, we were conceived in this insane mania about all men being created equal. And when you start out with the direction wrong like that, you're not going to end up at the right destination.
Well, the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence, they couldn't have possibly conceived of the world that we have today and the sorts of immigration that's coming into the United States. Their whole world was other Englishmen. I think that it went without saying for them that they were talking about other Englishmen.
Well, I don't think so. I'd like to excuse them since my ancestors were involved in the revolution. But I look to Haiti. People like to think that whites are superior to black people. I think black people are superior to white people in many respects. When Haiti declared its independence from France and wrote its first constitution, written up by Dessalines, the black that conducted the genocide of the whites in Haiti, they were more farsighted. They put in the Haitian constitution that no white man could ever be a citizen of Haiti and could never own as much as a square inch of Haitian territory. So that they saw the future a lot more clearly than Jefferson. They made it very clear this is going to be a black republic. It's a black man's country, and that bar to white people even owning a business or anything in Haiti, that remained in place until the American Marines went in the 19-teens, and Franklin Roosevelt sat down at his typewriter in the 1930s and wrote the new Haitian Constitution. So Dessalines, as an uneducated former black slave, he could see the future. Why couldn't our ancestors?
I don't know. Do you think that it would have helped if Chief Justice Taney had cited Dessalines in the Dred Scott opinion?
I didn't. I'm so ignorant. I didn't know until very recently that the Dred Scott case was a collusive lawsuit. Did you know that?
Yes, of course it was.
I had no idea. I'd managed to live 75 years and live in our area of the political waterfront, and I'd never found that out.
That's how they taught it at the University of Chicago Law School.
I'm going to have to leave. Thanks.
I do too. It's been over an hour and a half, and I'm an old man, and I get tired, so it's time for me to go to bed.
Well, thank you, Paul. You're gone already, but thank you, Sam, and Jason. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you'll join us again real soon, because it was good having somebody.
Yes.
I think half our age is a good idea.
And I think
great conversation. Good joining you, gentlemen.
You should talk about Charlottesville next time. All right.
Well, I told him I have no problem talking about the new updates. I just don't want to go rehashing the basic elements of Charlottesville, but there are new things that are happening from time to time.
All right, we're going to
get together again, Jason, and we'll talk about it. Actually, would you like to join us again on Friday?
Perhaps. Let me look at my work schedule. We'll correspond.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for joining us tonight, and good night. Take care. Night from New Orleans, Louisiana. Well, that was interesting, and it is good.